Welcome classic rock fans to another 10 of the best, 10 best albums of the 1980s. For this video I want to focus on artists that are firmly rooted in the decade, rather than artists that just happen to release excellent albums during this time period. So no Graceland, no Born in the USA. And stick around to the end because I've got a few honourable mentions for you. So number 10 on my list is The Pretenders and Pretenders 2, which came out in 1981. Interestingly, Chrissie Hynde in her autobiography ends it after the release of this album, implicitly suggesting that the Pretenders as a band ceased to kind of exist after this album, that the Pretenders that followed was more or less a band organised around her, or the cult of her identity. And the first two albums are excellent, melodic, with just enough punky sneer to pick our interests. And let's not forget Hynde was involved with a lot of the early incarnations of these great punk bands, including projects like Masters of the Backside and the Moors Murderers, which I believe was perhaps initiated by Steve Strange. But the Pretenders also take a lot of influence from that 1960s Baroque pop as well. In fact, one of the first singles, Stop All Your Sobbing, produced by Nick Lowe, I think it was the only song Nick Lowe produced for the Pretenders, suggests, or certainly advertises, Chrissie Hynde's love of the Kinks. As regards the cover of this album, Chrissie Hynde absolutely hated it. She felt it was too contrived, too staid really. Not to mention, of course, that bassist Pete Fondon was green around the gullet due to his heroin addiction, and his face had to be heavily photoshopped for this image. You can tell if you look at it closely that it's been tampered with. Of course, it was a habit that would take him off really within a very short time after this photograph was posed for. The same malady, of course, would take off James Honeyman Scott as well, just a few weeks afterwards. An excellent guitar player, very undersung guitar player as well, and it's very much instrumental in shaping the sound of those early Pretenders records. So in the space of a very short period of time after recording this album, half the band were gone. Although Pete Fondon was gone before then anyway, because he was sacked, I think, due to his proclivities, shall we say, making him incapable of performing. Number 9 for me is The Stone Roses, a debut album from 1989. Bob Stanley from Melody Maker called it godlike and psychedelic, and I must admit I certainly remember this blaring out of every car stereo around about this time. I found it strangely trippy at a time when heavy metal had gone all MTV on us, and pop music was on the verge of that cultural reimagining that was Britpop. The Stone Roses was part of that Manchester scene which saw a melding of indie music with that drug-fueled rave culture. But what attracted me to this band was the sheer arrogance, I suppose, epitomised in Ian Brown's nonchalant vocal delivery, baggy jeans and lager-lout swagger. I mean, this was an excellent debut album, of course, before the band, in the words of Pitchfork, bled out in a slow agony of contractual disputes, internal discord and eventually public indifference. This band also had their detractors, of course. I mean, Robert Christgau said, what is it that this band do that Buffalo Springfield and the Byrds didn't do better in 1967? But I enjoy this album. It has an authenticity when a sense of plasticness very much dominated the UK charts. Number 8 is The Cramps, The Songs the Lord Taught Us from 1980. This record came out in 1980, was released on IRS in the USA and Illegal Records in the UK. I just love the psychobilly strut of this one, which, in the words of Wikipedia, melds the kitschiest moments of the Ramones or Blondie into the whole new realm of garage trash novelty. Lux Interior rives his way through these numbers like a twisted amalgam of Iggy Pop and Carl Perkins. He howls these rage-inflected numbers, and we get the mirthless Poison Ivy, who claims to have formed her own identity from the clay of Link Wray and Dwayne Eddy. She's unapologetically sexual and restrained at the same time. This band are clearly obsessed with 1950s rock and roll, as well as, in the words of Pitchfork, the contemporaneous artifacts of lowbrow culture, B-movie sexploitation flicks, serial killers, pin-up girls, the B-52s on steroids. This is a great album and a great band. I'm hoping there is a reissue campaign regarding this band's studio albums, especially from the success of the aforementioned Netflix series Wednesday, where their song Goo Goo Muck has gone absolutely viral. Interestingly, Goo Goo Muck was originally a kind of a novelty hit in 1962 by Ronnie Cook and the Gay Lads. Number 7 is the Pixies' Doolittle from 1989. This album brought the curtain down on the 1980s and will continue to inform rock for at least another 20 years after that. This album's offbeat and dark subject matter with reference to biblical violence, torture and death would strike a note with music fans and critics everywhere. In fact, Peter Kane, writing for Q magazine, praised Doolittle's carefully structured noise and straightforward rhythmic insistence. Even NME, in their own brand of quirky hyperbole, described it as the second greatest album of all time. This album follows Surfer Rosa, which many probably feel is a better album. This album certainly feels more accessible, reaching a lowly 98 on the Billboard charts, I believe. It's an album that's grown in stature retrospectively, like many, many great albums before it. It's an album of contrasts from quite gorgeous melodies, I think, to sort of filling, loosening rock, with Black Francis screaming his heart out, sometimes within the context of just one song. This album is undoubtedly muscular, shall we say, with some quality tunage to boot. Many argue that this record certainly helped ignite the fires from which the grunge movement was forged. Number 6 is Marillion's Script for a Jester's Tear from 1982. This album feels a little bit out of place on here, as the music certainly doesn't feel like 1980s music, and of course it isn't really. It's a harkening back to a 1970s progressive rock, albeit neo-prog was the label conferred. But listening to it at the time, it felt like the perfect antidote for that plastic synthetic sheen of synth pop, and as well as the panto of the New Romantics. It's an album full of dark gothic melodrama and menace, narratives that effectively pick at the scab of Thatcher's Britain, albeit through a reconfiguring of 70s prog. We had drug numbers and Chelsea Monday, perhaps foreshadowing the Me Too movement, as well as numbers that dealt explicitly with the Troubles. All this delivered by a towering fish, all face paint, stalking the stage like something out of a medieval morality play, scaring the shite out of his audiences. And the B-sides weren't half bad either. You had the gloriously bloodthirsty Grendel and Three Boats Down from the Candy. Script for a Jester's Tear in the Market Square Heroes EP establishes that jester image or motif that the band would employ all the way through the 80s, under the guiding hand of the brilliant artist Mark Wilkinson. That is before, of course, the band under Steve Hogarth decided to commit Jestercide, A New Broom and all that. And subsequently the band's music moves away from Supper's Ready to more XTC and Brian Eno. Number 5 is R.E.M's Life's Rich Pageant from 1986. This album took the Athens band away from the confines of their geek college audiences. And believe it or not, Michael Stipe actually enunciates properly. Gone is all that subterranean mumbling, as well as the southern gothic that was explored on the Fables of the Reconstruction album. This album spawned the wonderful Fall On Me, which is actually Michael Stipe's favourite R.E.M. song, and the cover of the Clique's Superman sung by a mealy-mouthed Mike Mills. My God, you try saying that. The album saw a return to the jangly guitars of the older albums, but a more fully developed and unique sound, best represented on numbers like Begin the Begin, These Days and Swan Swan H. This album was quite a political album, as was the Green album which came afterwards, with topics such as the disappearance of dissidents in Guatemala, as well as ecological issues. Slant magazine listed this as number 52 in its greatest albums of the 1980s, stating that Life's Rich Pageant marks that seamless transition between the band's formative period and their commercial dominance. Interesting, the cover was part the face of Bill Berry and part a couple of bison, not only representing the album's ecological theme, but also a pun, I think, a visual pun on Buffalo Bill. This album was certified gold within the year, so it was an important record for them. Number 4 is U2 and the Joshua Tree from 1987. This is the band's 5th studio album and is very much characterised by a harder hitting sound and more traditional song structures, especially when compared to the more ambient experimentation of the Unforgettable Fire. The songs on this album are very much operating within the paradigms of American and Irish folk music. The lyrics are socio-political and imbued with a kind of mysticism embellished with spiritual imagery. What is intriguing about this album, I think, as one critic has pointed out, is the band's antipathy towards real America, and how that rubs up against their fascination for mythical America. Picasso famously said that the purpose of art is to wash the dust of daily life off our souls. And this album explores the rather unpalatable idea that maybe the dust and grime is actually a part of our souls. I think it was one philosopher, I don't know who said it, but navigating this world is about reconciling the glory and the scum that occupies every human heart. The Joshua Tree focuses on the idea of displacement, and is arguably U2's most important album, although my personal favourite is the Achtung Baby. Some have suggested this is quite an American sounding album. It's certainly one that references the band's experiences there, and certainly references the American dream, whilst at the same time still having a deep appreciation for their roots and heritage. Bono is at his most earnest here. We get numbers like Where the Streets Have No Name, With or Without You, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For. Songs that would, of course, not only become live staples, but have never lost their power and impact over the years. We could argue that the Joshua Tree shows the world's biggest band at this juncture, struggling to find their own place and trying to come to terms with a sense of rootlessness. Joshua Tree, rootlessness. See what I did there? Number 3 is The Cure's Pornography from 1982. This album is their 4th album and is hailed as a proto-goth masterpiece. It's a dark album, to say the least, dominated by these relentless hypnotic dirges. This album is often referred to as the 3rd and final instalment in their Gloom trilogy. We get songs like 17 Seconds Faith and the oppressively dense 100 Years with that remarkable opening riff. Its use of repetitive drum and bass patterns adds to this claustrophobic and oppressive feel of this one. It is a murky opus that displays moments of great musicality, as well as getting that kind of nonchalant Robert Smith shrug. His deadpan voice is the black cherry on the top of this particular cake. Thematically, we twist and contort with songs like Siamese Twins and The Figurehead. It is an album that speaks of helplessness, I think, and certainly perhaps reflects Robert Smith's frame of mind at the time. This album comprises of 8 songs, a litany of misery, despair and isolation. It's hard to imagine this same band, of course, very shortly thereafter this one would go on to do a song like Love Cats. Number 2 is Prince and Purple Rain from 1984, the album that saw Prince ascend to rock star glory. If I may quote Wikipedia, much of this album has a grandiose, synthesised and psychedelic sheen. I think many of us would find it hard to disagree with that. I think the music on this album is widely regarded as Prince's most pop-orientated stuff, but nevertheless there are some pointers on this record as towards the more experimental stuff he would engage with later on. This album stylistically is a diverse album that flip-flops between the metal funk rock of Let's Go Crazy to the synth soul pop I Would Die For You, and of course closes with that epic title track. This album is a remarkable record that still sounds fabulous today. I think this album demonstrates his ability to take any type of music and sprinkle it with that magic Prince dust and make it unmistakably his. I think no one has managed to replicate, let alone surpass, some of his best material. Someone once said that greatness in art is not to find what is common, but what is unique, and I certainly think he's achieved that. Number 1 for me is The Smiths' The Queen Is Dead from 1986. This album is a striking album thanks to Morrissey's hilarious and dark lyrics, in which he vents his spleen at Thatcherism. Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty is a wish to be back in a better time, I think. This album is infused with the Smiths' trademark ennui, at a time when the pop charts was characterised by the jangle of post-punk guitars and electronic blueberry. I think the Smiths really stood out, especially possessing what one critic has identified as that devastating melancholia that quickly morphs into sardonic lyrical megalomania. But it's that kind of indie nonchalance that quickly establishes Morrissey's trademark apathetic mope. If we think about some of the songs on this album, frankly, Miss Shankly is a riposte, a terse riposte at the fakery of the music industry. My God, how pertinent is that these days? Many have argued that this album hails the hails the death of all that electronica in popular music in the 80s and brings forth a new guitar-driven sound, what some have termed the second coming of the British invasion. And Johnny Marr's tone and execution is absolutely remarkable, especially his liking for those big guitar riffs on numbers such as Big Mouth Strikes Again and Some Girls Are Bigger Than Others, and the alarming arresting quality that those riffs have add a sense of existential panic, I think, to Morrissey's lyrical defeatism. What is striking about this album is the way that the music fuels and feeds off, I think, the tension between Marr's desire to play great rock music and Morrissey's wit. A fop-head manifesto that foreshadows the 90s. So there you are, they're my favourite albums of the 1980s, and as a few honourable mentions, I'd have to mention The Replacements' Let It Be from 1984, and New Order's Power, Corruption and Lies from 1983. Also another album that I loved from the 1980s, which I see as an important album anyway, is Adam and the Ants' Kings of the Wild Frontier that came out in 1980. I love that record. So there you are, they're my favourite albums of the 1980s. Plenty to get your teeth into there. Please share this video, like and leave a comment. It all helps the algorithm. Other than that, I just hope you're well, staying safe, but more importantly that you keep listening.